Hi, and welcome to the first video on this channel. So the idea behind the channel was, well, it was initially that I was just going to yap about topics from history, but it sort of evolved. I was looking for revision content for my A-level students, and I was just a bit taken back by the amount of what I'd call AI slop out there. And so I thought, obviously, I'm going to make this channel. It's going to be nothing fancy to begin with. I haven't got a video editor or anything basically. Hoping to change that in the future, but for the time being, I'm just going to yap about history basically. I'm going to try and make it relevant to what my students need to hear at the moment, but I'm open to ideas on any future topics. And you know, if you've got anything you'd want me to debate, the more controversial the better, drop it in the comments and I'll make a video on it, just yapping away. So today then, we're going to be discussing Chiang Kai-Shek and his leadership of China. Basically tackling the question, was he a good leader or not? And now, just a disclaimer, I'm only going to be discussing up until 1949, in which he fled to Taiwan, the Republic of China, on the basis that it's a bit more black and white, I feel, after that period. He does change stuff throughout the whole of his time in power, but I feel once he arrived in Taiwan, it's much more like clear cut on the morality of his leadership. And so we're going to keep this discussion pre-1949. And so just helping my students keep up with this, a bit of background info on Chiang Kai-Shek. So he's born in 1887 into China, that's still ruled by the Qing dynasty at this point, okay? He was a trained military officer. He followed a career in the military, okay? And it was in his early years in the military that he became a close associate of Sun Yat-sen, and he starts to climb the ranks in the Kuomintang. He consolidates his control after 1925. With Sun Yat-sen's death, he was at that point in control of the Wanpao Military Academy. And because the majority of the military that he'd created was loyal to him, it was, I'm not going to say a logical step that he would take command, but really, there's no one in a position to stop him from taking command. And so that was obviously how he climbed to being the leadership of the Kuomintang. Where he really becomes famous, though, is in his leading of the 1926 Northern Expedition. This is obviously a campaign in which the Kuomintang push into the rest of China in an attempt to try and unify China into a national government. It was currently at that point fractured quite horribly in the warlord era, and his mission was he was going to unify the country underneath the Kuomintang, underneath his leadership, okay? And he goes on in 1927 to launch the Shanghai Massacre, in which he purges the communists from his party. He also tries to start push out leftist elements of his party as well. But yes, that's the situation. By 1928, he had pretty much consolidated control of. Actually, I'm jumping ahead there as well. He had marginally consolidated control of China. He ended the warlord period by 1927, but I'm jumping ahead into the pros and cons for him already. But yes, that's what we're going to discuss today. And so there's a lot of people out there that argue Chiang Kai-Shek was a good leader. I'm not going to disagree or agree for that matter at this point, but I'll break down the arguments of why some people would think he was a good leader. I was touching on it a second ago, being dragged into it. The main point put forward is the political stabilization. He ends the fragmented warlord era, and this obviously, by doing this, he gains international recognition as well. So foreign investors per se, see China as a more stable place to invest in, to deal with, okay? So I have to give him credit for that. He brings an element of stability, okay? He also ushers in what's known as the Nanking decade from 1927 to 1937. In this period, you do see, I'm not going to say great, I was about to say great. You do see development when it comes to infrastructure, okay? Particularly focusing in the urban areas. There's great railway expansion, he does expand transport networks throughout the country. And there are financial reforms as well that are somewhat successful as well, okay? So he brings an element of, the Nanking decade is known as a time of stability in what had been a very hectic period for China. In addition to this, I have to give him credit as well for his wartime leadership. from the Japanese, well, from the outset of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, he was a resilient leader. There were the Kuomintang with the Chinese suffered multiple defeats throughout that period, but still he kept relocating the capital and fighting on, basically. And so you do have to give him credit for just holding together a semblance of government in face of the Japanese aggression. Yeah, and so they're the arguments I most commonly see put forward for why he was a good leader. Why he was a bad leader is, I would argue, somewhat more convincing, but I'm not going to go into the conclusion of the matter yet. So in terms of his bad leadership, or why he wasn't a good leader, I dwelled on this a bit a second ago, but his control was always limited in China. Now, I'm not sure if I can say this is an inherent fault of his, but when I'm looking at how he led China, but he didn't really ever have complete control. You know, the warlords, he negotiated with many of them, he defeated many of them in battle, and he negotiated with others, okay? As a result of this, though, he always had somewhat limited control, that the warlords still exist. Now, on the surface, you know, they were working with Chiang, but in practice, they were very still out for their own goals. And I mean, you see evidence of this in Chiang's encirclement campaigns, that the Kuomintang forces would fight the communists quite devotedly, with quite high morale. But warlord forces, the warlords would always try and conserve their forces. And so when, like, for example, when Mao and the CCP eventually do escape in the final encirclement campaign, it was warlord troops let them pass, because the warlord doesn't want to risk losing them, basically. So Chiang always has a sort of limited control over China in this period, more so than during the warlord period, but it's still very limited. The biggest not the biggest, I see a lot of critiques of Chiang Kai-Shek, but a big one I see is when it comes to his economic mismanagement and corruption. And so the primary problem is all of his reforms I mentioned, be it economic, political, were focused largely in the urban areas. And so his support always came from the industrialists and the middle classes. And as a result, like, his investment, this is showing his investment, the projects he invests in are all based around focusing on improving life in the cities. The problem he has, though, is the majority of China is rural at this point. The majority of the population are like agricultural peasants, be it. And so his reforms miss them, so they feel very alienated. And of course, Mao, on the other hand, focuses on trying to appease the peasants, trying to win them over to his cause. And I think this is a large reason that eventually leads to his overall downfall. Another critique, so that was economic, talking about corruption. The Kuomintang was rampant with corruption, and I can see two examples of this. Towards the end of his reign in the late 40s, there was rampant hyperinflation throughout the country. To settle this, he introduced a new currency called the gold yuan. And the problem was, though, that members of the Kuomintang, knowing that this currency change was coming, would, sold off all their previous cash investments, and so that when the new currency was introduced, they weren't affected by it. However, the middle classes, who were, people who weren't inside his clique as such, had no idea this currency change was coming, and their savings were wiped out and stuff. So while many members of the inner circle of the Kuomintang profited, the middle classes were obliterated, losing the majority of its support base. You can see this as well with US aid that is sent to them during, the Second Sino-Japanese War, what is by this point World War II. There's numerous examples where they take the aid received by the US and sell it on in the black market. And so you have soldiers going to fight the CCP unequipped, poor, not unpaid, It is just very badly managed. And so he gets a lot of critique for that. I couldn't as well not mention the 1938 Yellow River flood. And in an attempt to stop the Japanese in the Second Sino-Japanese War, he destroyed the dikes along the Yellow River, which flooded a massive swathe of Chinese territory. It ultimately led to the deaths of about 500,000 people. Now, a lot of historians argue on this one that, it was a necessary measure to stop the Japanese, but I just struggled to get behind I struggle to get behind the argument that sacrificing 500,000 people to slow down the Japanese is a just thing. I mean, put it into perspective, the British lost about just above 400,000 people in the Second World War for the whole 6-year period of the Second World War. And Chiang kills more than this in just one event. It's just, I struggle to see how a leader can call shots like that are going to lead to the deaths of 500,000 people. But I digress. I'm a bit of a privileged position as a Brit discussing that, because we've never been in a situation where we've had to make sacrifice on that scale. But I just when evaluating if he was a good leader or not for China, I can't ignore those sorts of decisions. I think it shows in a way just a disregard for the lives of your average Chinese person underneath his leadership. Practically as well, I can critique it that the areas that he did flood then went on to become communist hotspots, because naturally the peasants who'd lost their livelihoods turned to communism as a way to get back at Chiang Kai-Shek. And so that's basically the arguments for him being a bad leader before 1949. Concluding then, I digress. There were short-term successes, and he gets credit for these. You know, he did turn the urban areas of China he modernized areas of China. I'll give him credit for that in the rural areas. But he failed to address corruption. He failed to gain popular support, and ultimately in 1949 he did lose control to Mao. And so I think shows the fact that he's obviously kicked out China. I digress. He was a determined leader, but an unsuccessful leader. And so overall, it's a tricky one. Morally, I think he was questionable. Practically, he made many mistakes, I think largely outweighing the positive changes he made. But I think most importantly, and one of the things that ultimately cost him his popular support, was that he lost sight of Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles to quite a large extent. He was so absorbed with combating the threat of communism that he left behind the values that the Kuomintang actually stood for. You know, cost him the support of the majority of the Chinese population. And so I'd have to conclude on this one that overall he was not a good leader for China. Well, that's the end of my rant for today. I was planning to rant for about 5 minutes, but I love the topic, got dived into it a bit too much anyway. And so stay tuned. I'm going to be ranting about lots of stuff coming up. I'm going to try and focus on China to begin with, just because, as I mentioned before, my students do need it. But like I said, I'm open to ranting about anything, and we'll probably rant about some pretty random things throughout the next few weeks. But no, thank you for watching, and take care until next time.